So gather around. I'm going to draw here, and we're just going to get in.
Gather around. He's got stuff to say, that's for sure.
It's largely unproven and a little bit raw. But I think it'll open some thinking. And if it doesn't make sense, you can join me later and we'll all go drinking.
Nice.
Okay. Yeah, it works. Okay, I'm gonna share this framework with you. I know many of you have seen this already, but I think the exercises kind of give us a clue about it. So the experiment we were just doing was kind of a clue in terms of the different kinds of systems and different kinds of dynamics that we encounter on a regular basis. And the thing is that systems range from being really simple, problem sets range from being really simple to being really chaotic. And the essence of this whole little teaching this morning is that if you use the same decision-making tools in all these different domains, you're going to find yourself lost a lot of the time. So this particular framework I find really useful. It's called Cynefin. It's a Welsh word that means your spaces of multiple belonging. It's spelled C-Y-N-E-F-I-N. Cynefin. And it comes from the idea that in any moment, there's elements of all of this happening in the work that we're doing. So it's there's 5 domains in this framework, not 4. Although it looks like a 4x4 kind of matrix. And basically, I'm going to describe these 4 domains. Basically, there's one side of this model in which problems are largely unordered, and there's one side of this framework in which problems are largely ordered.
And this is on the journal website.
This is on the journal website. Yeah, there's tools and links to
videos.
Cognitive Edge, which is the group that's developed this in some detail, and I've worked with this for a long time. It's a big piece of my practice. So I'm going to describe these domains as we go around here. So basically, there's 5 domains. This is the domain of simple or obvious situations. This is the domain of complicated situations. This is the domain of complex. This is the domain of chaotic. And this is the domain of disorder. And the best way I can use to describe disorder is like, what the fuck? And I love when we were working in Chicago with the faith communities doing violence prevention and restorative justice. And so when I wrote that in the middle, somebody screamed out, "Oh, where's the family?" Which is a really good response when you're in this space. So I just want to be clear about how these are different from each other, because it's a fairly these domains. I would really like you to think of them as a gradient. So there's not really obvious boundaries between them all. The problems that we face in the world are gradiated between them. But I divide them up here so that we have a sense of the kind of archetypal problems. So in a simple system, the way we can distinguish all of these is with causality. So in a simple system, cause and effect are absolutely always the same and very simple, very straightforward. So an example of a simple system would be when you turn the tap on, the water comes out. And if the problem you're trying to solve is that the water is flowing from your faucet, you can turn the tap off and it will go off. Same with opening a door. Is a very simple problem. The door has a push bar on it. You're going to push it and open. And you know that because you've done it before and it's obvious. So you can always employ a best practice. Best practices are great and obvious systems. And that's the last you're ever going to hear about best practices. Because that's where they belong in terms of opening doors and turning taps off. In a complicated system, you have multiple causes and multiple effects, and there's like different kinds of choice points. right? So all kinds of different causes. So this is the domain of still in the ordered world. This is the domain of what we end up calling largely technical problems, where it can be really difficult to untangle the causes and the effects, but the system is completely knowable. So if you study it, and you do analysis, and you do research, and you bring in the people that know things, you can figure out the causal relationships between things. You can look at different effects. You can evaluate the efficacy of different effects. So, for example, if what you're trying to do is build a Boeing 747, I was working with Boeing airplane engineers. Boeing airplane engineers are amazing people because they're insanely curious about the world. All engineers are. But unless you open up their minds to the different problem sets, they just treat everything like a Boeing 747, right? So like poverty is basically a Boeing 747. So, you know, like if we're trying to build a commercial aircraft that can carry 400 people across oceans, we need the right materials, we need the right engineering, yada, yada, yada. And when you go to Boeing and you sit in the vehicle assembly building at Boeing, you'll see that there's big Gantt charts and to-do lists, and people kind of come and they go, what do we do next? Oh, yeah. Put in that rivet, what do we do next? And like all the planes are basically assembled by hand. The parts are built by robot, but people just checking stuff off a Gantt chart. And when I was there with a friend of mine, I said, this is it? Like, it's just a big to-do list? And he goes, yeah, but it's like a $800 billion to-do list. I mean, we've invested a lot of money in it. You know, but basically, the problem's solved. And in the complicated domain, your job as an engineer is to come up with a series of good solutions, good practices. Right? So this is the domain of good practice. And good practice can be evaluated with summative evaluation. So you can you can build a 747 out of aluminum and then decide that you can actually make a plane more efficiently out of a composite. And then you can build a 787 because the new Dreamliners are built out of composites. Because they've done years and years of evaluation and look at how materials work and develop new materials. So summative evaluation, right, which is where you evaluate something at the end of its creation, is a really good evaluation tool for this kind of technical problem. And it gives you good objective data. You can make really good strategic decisions based on that good objective data, right? So within even within organizational life, there's complicated problems you have to face all the time, like contracting arrangements, for example. So procurement strategies are just complicated. They're not necessarily really, there's elements of complexity to them, but basically when you get a really good procurement strategy, you can evaluate it over time, see how it works. You can use summative evaluation for that kind of thing, and you can come up with one or two good practices. You know you can't use a best practice because your context depends, you know, there's a little bit of it depends, because, well, here's a great thing that this manufacturing firm did, and we don't exactly do manufacturing, but it's still a good procurement process, so we have to shape it a bit, so it'll be a good piece for us, right? Follow what I'm saying? Okay, so good practices live in this domain. As we move along here, you'll find that context becomes more and more important, right? To the point where when we cross this line, we enter into a phase shift in the kinds of problems that we're dealing with. So in the complex world, causes and effects are emergent. So you have a whole bunch of causes that interact with each other, and then you have an effect that occurs, right? So racism is a really good example. Or the story I love to tell here is actually, I'll tell the story of the stigma work we did with Devin. So we use this framework, where are you, Devin? We use this framework, right, to kind of get a sense of the kind of problem we were facing when we were doing this project on addressing stigma in the health system, stigma directed towards people with mental health and addictions. And turns out there's stigma in the healthcare system for people who are addicted to drugs and who have mental health issues. And it creates really poor health outcomes, right? Like it actually has a role. And so there were a couple of studies that came out, right? We began the work that were showing this, and that's what led me to the project, yeah? And so, if I'm not mistaken, didn't you sort of go and look for where stigma exists, like try to find a stigmatizing person?
What we did was go and have conversations, the sensing it's interviews, but how is stigma impacting people's work and what the work they're leading, and how is it affecting their ability to make the kind of change that they're trying to make?
Right.
And discovered that, of course, it's impacting everywhere.
Right. But I also remember a conversation where we couldn't find anybody that would admit to stigmatizing people.
Yeah.
But stigma's in the system, But it's like, but we were looking for the person who woke up in the morning going, I'm going to stigmatize 5 junkies and 3 crazy people. That's what I'm going to do today. Right? Because if you look at the system, you'd think it was full of people who think that way. Right? But you couldn't find a single person. Oh yeah, stigma's a huge problem. It affects my work and my clients' work. It's like, are you a stigma? Oh, I'm not a stigmatizing person. It's like, are you? No. Is she? No, she's not either. So it's this emergent phenomenon. It's really interesting. Like, where does it come from? Right? And so
the cause isn't dependent on a particular point. It's dependent upon how people are interacting with each other.
What was the line that was used? Interdependent.
Multiple interdependent variables.
Multiple interdependent
Thank
variables.
you. I was like, that sounds like every project I'm in.
It is.
Yeah.
And
we ran into stigma from a funder, and they were saying, how do you explain to the wealthy parents out in Parkland School District why we ran out of money because we gave it to people addicted criminals?
Right.
That was the way it was said to us.
Right.
Of course, we hit the roof.
Right. That's awesome because that becomes simple because you can address that kind of cause head on, right? But it still doesn't address the reality of stigma systemically or stigma in society. So I just use that as an example to say that many of the problems that we face in all facets of life and work are complex, and there isn't a direct causality. You can't attribute like this cause equals that of, and if we just find this, and this is one of the follies of finding leverage points, but I'm going to come back to this. If we assume that a leverage point is kind of the cause of all causes, then we can reduce, and if we just say, well, all we need to do is train people, because I think we talked about that, all we need to do is train people in stigma awareness, and that'll help. Well, it's not like people haven't been trained in stigma awareness or in awareness of mental health and addictions issues, and it's not like people aren't generally kind, right? So it's not just like the causality of stigma as an emergent phenomenon is really interesting, and you can get yourself in knots by trying to figure out what's going on. So in the complex system that we played in just now, where people were tied to each other, right? It's like almost impossible to map the causality of everything going on, but there was definitely emergent order, right? There was definitely order that was emerging. And when we ran our little experiment around gender, we discovered that there was a really interesting, strange attractor in the system. And it's given me a great idea for running this. I would love to run that exercise more. We could start to find out, like, where are the influential agents in the system. But you can only do that by probing. There's no way we could have guessed, right? And even if we'd asked Mark, like, are you the one that's dragging everybody around? Mark would be like, how do I know? I'm just trying to follow these 2 people. Like, it's not like he meant to be the white man with the tall gait and the...
Right, but not wearing black. So
not wearing black.
With a bit, you asked for a quick visual.
Yeah.
How many people attracted to color?
Yeah, but he didn't,
You didn't know that when he got dressed.
I'm not stigmatizing.
I got a black shirt, I can go.
Just become more invisible, please.
He's not completely self-conscious about it. But he wasn't out there stigmatizing the whole system, and yet the whole system moved when Mark began to move. And that would have been true of others. We would have to probe a little bit more to see where that was true. So I'm going to come back to that as a strategy.
And then patterns would have become visible.
Absolutely. And
right?
then you
That's
can begin to
saying.
address patterns. So working in complexity is not working with a strategic plan where you know what the outcome is going to be. Right?
So, for example, if we'd done that and found out of all the men in the room, how many of them had the force to move the whole system or majority of the system versus the ratio of how many women had that power in the circle, we could have done an assumption, a very raw assumption, about the invisible impact of gender influence in this system.
Yeah, I understand.
Right?
And we could have tested it, and we could have planned
But you
some
could also
little...
do it in other systems. So what is the behavioral norm?
And so the evaluation method we need here is not summative evaluation, it's developmental evaluation. It's about learning about the system as we're experiencing it, and as we give it a poke, we need to be learning about it right away. So the kind of learning that happens in complex systems needs to be very rapid feedback loops, right? And feedback loops that happen very instantly. So that's one thing. So World Cafe, like a lot of dialogic methods, are very good ways of getting feedback from things. Sensing interviews, very good ways. So if we had run this experiment, I'm getting all kinds of design ideas, but if we'd run this experiment and then sat down and done some sensing interviews and then run it again, sat down and done, we might have learned more about the system and been able to identify what the strange attractors were, what some of the dynamics were. Because you can run this experiment every single time, it's going to work because, the constraints on the system mean that all the agents are connected but ignorant of their effect on the system. But there's always going to be different kinds of patterns, and we could have surfaced gender, we could have surfaced race, we could have surfaced like all kinds of other things, color
height.
or height or all kinds of other things in the system.
It's a good exercise to show that to change the system, you can start anywhere.
Yeah, you can start anywhere as long as you're learning. So don't assume that you can just choose any cause and let it go and everything will be good. You need to build in that feedback loop. So the problem that happens a lot in addressing complex issues is that the funders, for example, want your plan, they want your outcomes, and they're going to measure you against the outcomes. They're going to give you $10,000 and you're going to affect a 17% decrease in illiteracy in your neighborhood. Right? And at the end of the day, you're going to write the report that shows that because you're addicted to the money. And because there's no way you can prove it, you'll just lie anyway. I mean,
Well, you'll design for
it
it.
sort of gets you there, right? But I mean, that's a good strategy for getting funding. Because those of you that are working in complex systems know that you know the way this stuff works, you know what the funders need, it's just become strategic. The problem is that as a society, it stops us learning about how to affect these systems. So over the long term, it's actually creating the emergent phenomenon that some of you were discussing here, where it's like, my funders are disconnected from my work. It's like, why is that happening? It's like, could they just... Well, it's because...
they're approaching it from there when actually it's there.
And we feed...
Or they're analysing it from that perspective or that worldview, and actually that's the worldview of the reality. That's the reality.
And we feed them. We feed this.
Right?
Wow, I get it.
6 years!
I can think
Right?
of a good corporate example because
Great.
that's what happens in my company. The executives make a move,
Right,
creates absolute something down at the bottom. They don't get feedback, they don't learn.
right,
And so then the front line goes, the executive don't understand
right.
and don't have a clue.
That's what we were
It's
talking
because
about.
nobody understands they're working in a complex system. They think they're over here
Right,
in whatever, complicated.
complicated.
But you
Yeah.
tell
I had
us one of
exactly the
those.
same situation in an organisation I'm working in. I was like, what's your infrastructure that supports learning?
Yeah,
None.
nothing.
Nothing. There was infrastructure to support education, as in telling people, like,
Well, there's
but
infrastructure
not like
to make-
learning from our activity that can then feed back and inform decision making, or just inform people delivering
There
in an
is
ongoing way.
infrastructure, but what happens is because of the culture, the only kind of stuff that can safely go up is what?
Right.
Good news.
Exactly.
Or like
But-
these
News,
not
yeah.
so bad news.
Yeah.
You know.
That's
If
right.
you take one of your
Yeah.
funders or the people from
Yeah.
one of these systems and you actually invite them in to have a sensory experiential experience of that, you will start to have an ally or an
Absolutely.
advocate. Like that's what's you have to put them into the sensory experiential,
Exactly.
not just give them a piece of paper.
It's because this view
Without
of the world means that this is the mechanism.
Right.
If we can be really blunt about it,
Yeah.
I'm resisting being blunt, but
No, don't go.
but if this is the mechanistic view of the world, in a mechanistic view of the world, you can be outside the problem, right? And so funders often adopt that stance because they're, most of our society privileges a scientific, materialist, empirical view of things, where we can be out. Even the role of facilitation, right? I mean, I said it in the first night. As a facilitator, you're neutral. It's like, no, you're freaking neutral. If you're a tall, white-skinned guy walking into a room wearing a blue shirt, you're not neutral. It doesn't matter how good intentioned you are. Everyone keys in on you. That's just the nature of systems. You're not outside of the system. Because human beings are living systems, and there's like all kinds of emergent properties that begin to work. So if you can be, but we privilege these things. So you have a dashboard you use to report to your board. 3-4 basic little indicators. As long as the needles are in the right zone,
As long as
hey,
it's
you
sort
can do
of
whatever you
green
want.
or
Right.
yellow, they're happy.
And you know, as a strategic leader,
Yeah.
your mandate's dependent on giving those numbers
Right.
that allows you to continue to do the strategic work. And my heart breaks for middle managers.
Yeah.
Right? Because all of you, this is work we're doing with Leadership
You
2020.
go to the board, it has to be more or less green.
You're on. There's a fulcrum here,
Yeah.
and really good managers are gonna manage that
So how
fulcrum.
do you create the space for that sensing thing with, inviting that in?
So part of it is for me sharing, and I haven't quite finished it yet, but part of it for me is sharing this view.
Yeah.
Sharing this model and like really beginning. There's different methods you can use to work with this framework.
Yeah, like
One of them is for example, I was working with Royal Roads University, and they have a health advisory committee, and it's made up of there's a deputy minister from Alberta, there's like nurses union rep, there's just people from all through the system, And they come together every year and they just have a conversation about how Royal Roads and all of their offerings can benefit the healthcare system, writ large, like the big healthcare system. And so what we did was we just learned from anecdotes. One of the ways you work with this, and especially working with complexity, is you work with story. So we spent the whole morning telling stories about what are the leadership challenges in the healthcare system, where you work. Just all kinds of stories. Some of them were long, like 20-minute long story. Some of it was like a throwaway sentence. It's like, oh yeah, we just had a terrible misunderstanding between union and an employer. But anyway, so every little anecdote I heard, I just wrote like a little headline on a Post-it note. And by the end of the morning, with these 12 people in the room, we probably had 100, 150 stories, right? Just documented. And I just threw them into the middle here, into this disorder domain, because we don't know what to do with them yet. And then just before lunch, we began to break them out. So what are the simple challenges that we're facing in terms of this meeting the needs of healthcare? What are the complicated things? What are the complex challenges? And chaos, which I'll get to in a second. And so we broke out the Post-it notes and we began clustering them. So I think an example of a simple problem was that there was an issue around Royal Roads not responding to emails from applicants in time. So applicants were applying to Royal Roads or looking for information, they weren't getting it timely enough, so they were going and studying somewhere else. That's simple, right? Like respond in a faster time frame. It's not a complicated problem. So simple things like that. Complicated problem was there was a need emerged that we need to be creating a curriculum to teach nurses leadership much earlier in their career. So it was just directed specifically at nurses, but it was found that when nurses come into leadership positions in the healthcare system, they're not actually prepared, even though they've been doing years and years of work, and even though they've been honing actually their leadership practice, because it's really hard to be a nurse and not also really be familiar with leadership practices. But we didn't have a curriculum that would train them in leadership at the beginning, realizing that nurses at every level could benefit in leadership curriculum. So what do? You hire in experts, right? You sense what your problem is. You do an analysis of it by hiring curriculum development experts, and then you respond. And that's the strategy for a complicated domain. So easy, great. I mean, it's not easy to me. I don't know how to do it, but somebody I know knows how to do it, right? So it's complicated to me.
You can apply expertise because there's cause and effect.
You can apply expertise, and the experts find it easy, right?
Yeah, because that's their
cause and effect, and do it.
That's your typical corporate consulting model too.
Yeah, it is.
I'm going to write you a report.
Really?
I think it's just corporate. I think
That's what we've been calling diagnostic organizational development. More than trivial stroke. That's what we've been calling diagnostic organizational development. Yeah, you go in, you sense the problem, you do your analysis, and you provide the solution. And if you want to see how that works, watch the Netflix series House of Lies. Absolutely. No, House of Lies. Yeah, not House of Cards. House of Cards is the president one.
Yeah.
House of Lies is about McKinsey. It was written by a couple of consultants who worked for McKinsey, and it is absolutely brutal. It's funny, and anybody who's a consultant, don't feel you won't be affected by watching it. You will just be like, oh shit, I do that too. It's like Dave Pollard last night doing his thing about shit facilitators say. Did you see that?
That was hilarious.
That was funny, right? So you'll just find yourself in it. So House of Lies is exactly that kind of eat what you kill business consulting model. It's all based on the sort of diagnostic. Basically, we go in, we sell them a model, we solve their problem, we get a return on their investment, we come back. So it's all based in here. If you want to make a killing in the consulting world, do this. That's all I'm saying. Right?
You may not get any long-lasting helpful results.
Yeah, you'll have to pick up your soul at the coat check, but yeah.
How long? About 10 minutes, Crystal.
Yeah, got 10 minutes. So let me just finish with the chaotic one, and I just want to say that in a chaotic system, cause and effect are like completely unrelated, and the kinds of practices that work here are novel practices, right? Novel practices. And so you're going to do something in a chaotic system that you've never done before and you'll never do again. And it doesn't make much sense to then evaluate your actions and come up with recommendations. That's not going to work there. So your evaluation methodology in chaos is going to be the most rapid feedback loop you can get. So anybody been in combat? Curious? Or a riot? You've been in combat, yeah. Been in a riot? So you prepare and correct me if I'm wrong, right? You prepare, but then you're in it and everything changes. And you're never going back to that situation again. You don't get smart, you just get wise. More often you're in chaos, right? There's no smart soldiers, there's only wise ones. The smart ones are not, they don't come home. Yep.
I have a question about that. Just thinking a lot about work in human services, chaotic things happen.
Yeah.
Right? Someone has a psychotic break,
Mhm.
right? And it feels like, especially in those type of systems, we try then to plan for that.
Right.
So we put 15 rules in for the next time someone has a psychotic break at 3 in the morning, and they happen to have access to a gun.
Yep.
You know what I mean? Like, there's something about, like, even though chaotic things happen not that often, we try to plan to that extreme.
Or we end up building the whole system around them, actually.
Exactly, yeah.
Right? We end up building the whole system around the chaotic response.
Oh,
And,
yeah.
and trying to apply a complicated lens
Right.
to it, and, right?
But in those examples, Tuesday, would you not say, we try to put a simple solution in place for something that's chaotic? We try to come up with a best practice. What are we gonna do the next time somebody has a suicide attempt within the organization, as a participant, for example? Like, that's what and they're like, you can't predict what that's gonna be, there's too many variables.
Yeah, I think all of that's true. Yeah, and the orientation is that chaotic is the norm that we must plan for. So whether it's a simple or complicated response, or, and I'm getting myself a little confused. But as you were just saying that, because of that, oh, that's what's happening in a lot of systems. We're somehow using the outlier to move.
Yeah, that's true.
And I don't think that just happens in, you were saying social service?
Yeah, that's just.
Yeah, I mean, I've just been in this situation that's been happening in the corporate context where, like, the senior leadership had a psychotic breakdown,
Right.
right? And the implications of that across an entire department and its capacity to deliver were incredibly dramatic. I mean, it's a fundamentally chaotic situation.
Sometimes the only thing you know is what will make it worse, not necessarily what will make, so you plan.
Yeah, that's true.
against doing
So
what
what I
will
want to
work.
say about responses in the complex and the chaotic system is a container helps, right? But the context is going to be so dependent, right? That when you tip into a chaotic system, like there's very little learning you're going to be able to do. You'll be able to learn from it, but there's very little you're going to be able to apply to the next time it happens. But beginning to build a container helps you to make it into a complex system, right? So it helps you to be able to manage it a little bit, all right? But you're just managing, and that's why soldiers train. They don't. It's not like, well, if it's just chaotic, we might as well just throw everybody into battle and see what happens. No, you train. You train so that you can make as good decisions as possible, and so do social workers because they do the same thing. You train to make as good a decision as possible given the context and the circumstances. Okay.
But if you're trying to follow your 3 steps on your little card of what to do, then
Right.
Right, and if we accept that we're dealing in a context, a marketplace, an economy, a social context, an environmental context that is inherently and increasingly chaotic around us, our economic situation, our environmental situation, if we begin to accept that, then it becomes a lot about what are the containers, what are the conditions we need to put in place so we can function within that, right? And then it becomes about relationships. So if I'm thinking about some of the situations I'm working in which feel inherently chaotic, even though they're within highly structured situations, it becomes about the only way I can get through it is based upon the quality of relationships I have with the person I'm in it with. That's what makes it bearable, and that's what makes it navigable.
Right.
That's right, and that's exactly where I was going, Christoph. It's like, that's a container.
That's a container.
That's what a container is. It's the quality of relationships people have, and therefore whether they can deliver on results in an inherently chaotic situation.
So great.
Makes sense?
So,
I'm just learning this model right now. This is great.
So I want to touch on one more thing before we leave it behind, and this is going to lead into Caitlin's piece. So this is the decision-making model. Okay, this is a decision-making model. So at the end of the day, it gives you a clue about how to act in these contexts. And so I just want to cover this. So in the ordered world, basically, the way you deal with an ordered, simple system or complicated system, we've talked about. You sense it, you can do all your research and everything, and then you do an analysis of what's going on, and then you respond. In the most obvious things, it's like when you're confronted with a closed door, it's like, does this open out or in? So you're sensing, and then you're kind of categorizing your responses. Well, if it opens out, I push, and if it opens in, I pull. You're doing that neurologically, and then you respond. But it all happens so quickly, it's just obvious, right? In a complicated system, you need the planning. In a complex system, the way you respond in a complex system is you don't sense first, right? So a whole lot of research isn't going to get you a whole lot of value because the system is inherently complex. Right. And in fact, the moment you go in and begin to research it, you begin to change the system. So, especially if you're a big
Right.
player in that system,
Right.
which is one of the reasons why the Kellogg Foundation wanted to get out of the food system, because the
Right.
funding became a strange attractor for the food system and not the activists.
Right.
So complex systems organize themselves around what's called strange attractors, right? And we had a great example of what a strange attractor is like in a system. It becomes highly influential for no apparent reason. But if we probe the system, we can start to find out why that attractor becomes highly influential. And by probing the system, I mean doing things like telling some stories, doing some pattern finding, doing sensing interviews, and then like, oh, there's a strange attractor. What if we nudge that a little bit?
Are they based on? I'm really getting this for the first time.
Yeah.
Are they? And is that based upon like testing out hypothesis? Is
Yeah,
that
well,
like
the probe-
the
right.
lean startup agile thing. Like,
Yes.
I have a hypothesis to do with gender.
Yep.
Let's go test that out.
Yep, exactly.
Oh, it's not that. Oh, so then
Or,
you like
or
the
could it be?
Or,
Or
right,
what
yeah,
if?
exactly.
Or
So,
how do
exactly. So the
Yes.
probes are based on. This is the same as business startups. So
Yeah.
the probes are based on. This
Yeah.
is the same as like game startup or like tech startups. It's like test hypothesis, learn, develop, redesign.
Right.
Hypothesis, take to market,
Iterate.
learn, develop.
It's
yeah.
fail quickly, fail often,
Right.
fail quickly,
Safe.
iterate, learn.
Safe to fail.
Interesting.
So what we need to do here is we need to want to see how the system works and how we can leverage it, move it, participate in it. And so we create safe to fail probes. These are not pilot projects that will run for 5 years and then evaluate.
Right.
A safe to fail probe is much more rapidly iterative, right? In other words, we can build in rapid feedback
That's a
loops.
massive culture shift.
It is a massive, it is a
It
massive
is not safe.
epistemological and ontological shift.
Yeah.
Not just culture. It's a massive way of, you have to shift your thinking about the
Yeah.
world, and you have to shift how you are being in the world
How you
to
show
do
up.
this.
Yeah.
This is a model of, for the
Massive.
academics, this is a model of ontology,
Yeah,
not epistemology. This is a model about being, not about knowing.
yeah.
Okay, so so safe to fail happens here. On this side, fail-safe solutions happen here, right? So on this side, we cannot tolerate failure. Bridge building, you don't get to let's build a little bridge, drive a car across it. Let's drive a 2,000 pound car across it. Oh, that held. Let's try a 2,500 pound car, you know? Like, that's not wise in complicated systems. But in complex systems, that's really wise, because you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, right? And assume that, oh, here's the answer, here's the plan, we're going to go ahead and do it.
This is great.
Because you don't have the latitude to fail.
So a lot of social issues are complex, and so how do you have safe to fail prototypes where there's high stakes?
Well, this is why there's this increasing interest in innovation labs and in design work and in prototyping stuff. All of that method and all of that way of thinking about the world, the reason why it's coming into this world now is because that's how you do it. You begin to do multiple experiments. So for the Stigma project, our response to Stigma was to have an open space meeting where we invited the whole system. Like, it was so cool. We had directors of health, we had doctors, we had healthcare professionals with addictions, because we realized there was a study that came out that said that 85% of healthcare practitioners have addictions. Oh, well, that explains where stigma's coming from. Like, that's,
I don't know that it's actually
with some high
It
number.
is significantly higher.
But it wasn't just addictions to drugs, but it was like addictions to work, addictions to food, addictions to sex or tobacco or alcohol, right? Not just cocaine and heroin. I mean, in addition, right? And so any unresolved addiction I have in myself, I'm going to project on somebody else. I mean, that's an obvious psychology 101. That's where stigma comes from. It's shadow projection. So we had people in the room. I mean, remember that doctor that was like talking about how he'd been an alcoholic for how many years? He testified on video. He was like, this is like, yeah. And he just was like, he sort of like came out to everybody as an alcoholic, and he had this, and it was like liberating for him. Because what we had done is we had changed the way we respond to stigma by defeating the idea that there's a hierarchy of care where the well people take care of the sick people, and framing the whole thing as a community of people with addictions looking after each other. And that was profound. So from that we created, how many 18 little probes that we ran, right? Just to see how we could get response in the system. And what happened to some of those? Did any of them survive the year?
I think one of them that was around trying to bring trauma-informed practice into Richmond Emergency Department
Right.
did move forward.
Right. And so we could learn a little bit from that. The unit was dismantled maybe 3 months after we.
Can I just say something about it too? So when something is invisible, when you don't know why the strange attractor is the attractor, but you don't, or there's stigma, but you don't know where it's coming from.
Right.
You know it's obviously there, you don't know where it's coming from. So one of my thoughts would be what we were talking about yesterday, is you say, okay, so we can't see it in the system, but let's look at the levels of system. Let's go from the organization to the group to the individual, and go, how and if this were to show up in any of those levels of the system, what might it be called? How do we detect it? And that might be an intervention point, right?
That's what I was going to share, is that
So you
when Chris
scale
was in
it.
Toronto in May, I'm working with a 2-year project of 15 to 20 community leaders, and we had just hit this place of chaos, or total chaotic, and I couldn't even understand why. And then you did this, and so what I did is I came back and I just brought it as a teaching tool, and I just said, for the next month, why don't we just sit in a self-reflective place around where are we each? Like, where are we as hosts of holding this vision of creating a collective healing space and movement? And so everybody did the personal, and then we unpacked it as a team. And it really helped everyone see what was missing to support us sitting in the complexity and holding each of our roles. And the interpersonal dynamics actually dispersed. There was less, because people were owning kind of where their comfort zone is and where their natural place to go is, that actually then helped us reorganize organically as a team and move forward to embrace the unknown.
Sweet. So good.
Yeah.
So,
Chris, can I-
Totally.
yeah, a quick one, and then we're going to.
Not really a question,
Sure.
I know we're out of time.
Yep.
This feels like so crux to me. I don't know if other people would say. I've worked with people in this, I've taught in this, and I'm getting a lot of nice nuance here, but it's at this point of like safe to fail, growing the system, and reality on the ground, working in a complex system. I just, if there's some way over the course of the next day and a half, to sort of maybe evening discussion.
Sure.
I think maybe others would be really interested.
I would be very happy to talk about this evening with folks and go on a little bit more. But one of the things I want to say in this leading into the work that we're going to do with Caitlin is that in a complex system, especially one where you are in a position of authority or leadership, how you show up is a very interesting strange attractor. So if you show up in a system as a leader afraid of the impact you're going to make, if you show up as somebody who's, I mean, we see this a lot in the Leadership 2020 work we're doing, as a leader who's afraid to claim the power they've just been promoted to, right? Do you see that? Somebody becomes an executive for the first time and they're like, I've always hated executives and now I'm one of them, right? Or if you show up as a facilitator with all the answers and you come in and things start going sideways and you start losing your shit, or you become a strange attractor in that system. It can become very influential very quickly. So when we say that this work of Safe to Fail is working on probes, one of the big pieces of work to do on ourselves is to be aware of our own impact in the system. Right? You're always going to have an impact in the system. So having a personal practice around being able to be clear as you walk into a system is really, really, really important. And that's why we're going to spend the rest of the morning on this particular personal practice. It may seem like it's like, wow, this is really personal, but how does this apply to system stuff? It applies to system stuff because you're a system. And when you show up in a system, you're a part of the system. And when you show up with any amount of
interdependent
authority, you're not just one of them. That's what I'm saying is you're not just one of them. You have power, you have influence, right? So how you turn up, and it's not just about like, okay, I'll take 5 minutes and I'll do some deep breathing before I walk in. That's not what I'm talking. Do that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about like do your 5 minutes of breathing, but if you still walk in scared shitless, right? Then we're in trouble. So we're going to do a bit of work on that.
And it's not even just the state of whether you're scared or not, or whether you're claiming your power or not. That's definitely a piece of it. And then it's like getting specific about what that is, because if you're part of that system, likely the things that are triggering you or the fears that are coming up for you are fears that are in that system. So you're also an indicator of that. So you have a way of working with that when you're working with yourself that is about how you show up, very valuable in how you attract, but also how you're able to start to work in yourself with some of the elements that are in the complex system. And it tends to, in the same way that it's complex, affect that pattern.
Right. So there's material on our journal website about this. There's links to Cognitive Edge, who again are the company that's developed this, worked a lot with it. I've worked a lot with this model and framework for the last 8 or 9 years, and worked with Cognitive Edge as well on a project that we did you and I did with immigrant and refugee work in the States on building welcoming communities. And that work went sideways because I think the leadership team generally thought what we were doing was a research project. And what we were doing was pattern finding and sensing.
Which is what the community leaders understood it to be.
And when we worked with the community leaders, we created a whole bunch of probes, and it was a really interesting way of responding. So I offer it here. This is a great boardroom model. In other words, you can take this into a boardroom, sit down with people, and really kind of talk about what this means. It's very clear. It works on the causality, and there's a lot of research, including the first place they published this paper was in the Harvard Business Review. So if you need credibility, it was about 1997 that the paper was published, and it's called A Leader's Framework for Decision Making. And it's a really good paper.
Was it 2007?
No. There was a version 2000.
No.
Or 2000.
There's an earlier
Yeah,
version.
it's an earlier version, maybe 2003 or
Yeah.
05. Snowden and Cynthia Kurtz.
Yeah.
And Dave Snowden. I think
There
it was
is
03.
another version.
Anyway.
At any rate, it's actually in our journal site. So all of these have become really good tools, and I think the way I've taught it here, I think it's very, start with the causalities and then think about these kinds of things. Study it a little bit, but if it makes sense to you, it's an excellent way of beginning the conversation about why all of these practices, all the practices we teach are generally geared towards complex stuff. So we don't teach accounting here, we don't teach personnel policy stuff, we don't teach legal contracting. Those are all important aspects of organizational life. That's all stuff you can get out of a box in many ways because they're just complicated, right? You can be working with them. It's the dialogic, meaning-making, sense-making, collaborative decision-making.
Container building.
These are the essential skills for complexity. That's what we're trying to bring into the world with this approach. So.
Can I ask
We're going to.
You can in the break.
We're going to start.
So
Anybody wants to talk to Chris?
Yeah, we're going to have a break. We're going to start again at what time?
10:30.
10:30. And I will stay right here in the middle, and we can continue the conversation.
Right. But we're going to start at 10:30. So please do whatever you need to do and be back here by 10:30 to begin again. Thanks, folks.
More control.